Welcome back to... It wasn't on purpose. Okay, there we go. Welcome back to the 4th ABRALITEC International Seminar. This time around, we're going to have our closing lecture. It's really my pleasure, and I bet you're going to enjoy this talk, which is titled, Who Are the Seen and Unseen in Society? Racialized Performativities, Narratives, and Identities. As you know, Professor Christian W. Chun from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, United States, will give this lecture. I'm going to read a really short bio from Dr. Chun. He is the author of 3 books, Power and Meaning Making in the EAP Classroom, Engaging with the Everyday, The Discourses of Capitalism, Everyday Economists and the Production of Common Sense, and A World Without Capitalism, Alternative Discourse, Spaces, and Imaginaries. And he had a talk on ABRALITEC YouTube channel. You can check that. And he was talking about this, A World Without Capitalism. And he is the editor of the volume Applied Linguistics and Politics. He is currently working on his next book, The Language of Our Politics, for Cambridge University Press. His research interests are discourse analysis, social linguistics, ethnography, class, race, and identity, language and political economy, linguistic landscapes, urban studies, visual studies, Asian American studies. So please, Dr. Chun.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I greatly appreciate it. So, although race and its socially and politically motivated co-constructions of particular identities have recently become a research focus in the English language learning classroom, the field of applied linguistics has not, for the most part, addressed the topic of racialized performativities, narratives, and identities through language and discourse, with a few exceptions, notably the work of Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa. Racialized discourses in social circulation emerge in the English language learning classroom via textbook representations of immigrant success stories and perceived racial and cultural differences among students and people beyond the classroom. So although some discourses may be well-intentioned in their attempts to acknowledge diversity, they warrant closer critical examinations for the ways in which specific cultural identities are ascribed, essentialized, and perpetuated in supporting racial hierarchies, and thus enacting the power dynamics of who is defining and who is the one being defined in being seen or unseen. So in this talk, I'll be presenting an autoethnography of my own lived experiences grounded in specific contexts and interactions with people, including friends, neighbors, students, teachers, and the community at large. I first started teaching in 1991 at a private ESL school in Los Angeles. Although at the time I had no undergraduate or graduate degree in TESOL, the school hired me because I was a so-called native English speaker. I was assigned to teach grammar at all levels. The majority of my students during my daytime classes were from South Korea and Japan, and many had either completed their undergraduate degrees in their countries or were taking a year off to study English in the United States. In my advanced grammar class with these students, there were a few notable times when they were the ones who corrected me when I chose the wrong answer in the Betty Azar grammar textbook's multiple choice questions. So if you took a random survey of people who self-identify as native English speakers, how many would be able to tell you what the past perfect tense is? They use it all the time, of course, but would all be meta-aware of this grammatical choice? Even though I had lived in the United States my whole life up to that point, grew up in an English-speaking home, and had gone to university, This was my introduction to the fallacies of the ideological positionalities of the native and non-native English speaker literacies, and the accompanying dynamics of assumed and ascribed identities that are enacted in the English language learning classroom between teachers and students. There was another crucial component that emerged during the first 16 months of my teaching at that school. I was also teaching evening classes in which the students were mainly adult Korean immigrants who were working in the Los Angeles neighborhoods of South Central and Koreatown. In the late April 1992, what has been called the 1992 Los Angeles riots took place after 4 white police officers were acquitted in the brutal beating of a man, Rodney King, who happened to be Black in the wrong place at the wrong time. In this case, merely driving over the speed limit on the highway. Haven't most of us done this? And was pulled over by the cops and offered no resistance when asked to get out of his car. These were not riots, but angry protests and uprisings against the decades and centuries-long incidents of police brutalities and violence against the Black communities across the U.S. The uprisings began in South Central and then spread northward into Koreatown. A student of mine had his store looted and burned. When he and my other students came to class that evening, the last thing they wanted to do was learn English grammar. They demanded to know why this was happening to them, since they saw no culpability in the injustices and oppressions against Black Americans highlighted by the Rodney King beating. Many of these students who had immigrated from Korea had no idea about the history of Black Americans other than they were enslaved for centuries. Not having gone to university, they had not read about U.S. history and had trouble understanding why some Black Americans were angry at them. This, despite some Korean immigrants' racist beliefs and acts toward the Black community, including the murder of a 15-year-old girl named Latasha Harlins by Soon Ja-do, a convenience store owner who shot Harlins in the back of her head as she was leaving the store because Do claimed Harlins was trying to steal orange juice, even though the video camera footage showed she was not. In my conversations with the students that evening and thereafter, especially the ones who were running small businesses in the predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods of South Central Los Angeles, these students told me their engagements with the local communities were mainly limited to only in-store interactions, with the latter's role solely as customers. None of the students lived in those neighborhoods, and when I asked them if they knew their customers outside the context of their store interactions, they replied they never engaged with the local residents in other communal or neighborhood spaces that would have enabled other identities to emerge in these spatial encounters. This seminal event was literally my on-the-ground introduction to alternative teaching approaches in the English language learning classroom, because I had to directly address the anger and anxieties voiced by my students. These aforementioned interactions with my students illustrate the inter-affecting connections of language use, racialized identities, societal and historical contexts, cultural ascriptions, assumptions, and positionalities in the English language learning classroom and beyond, in which these emerge regardless of what some teachers in school curricula might which otherwise or often try to ignore. The ideologically rooted fallacies and misconceptions of neutral teaching of the English language, and which English are we talking about, has had a long history in not only classroom practices, but also in the notions of what constitutes English language learner and teacher identities, with those dynamics in the classroom being microcosms of society. If anyone wonders why any of this and what will follow in my talk has to do with English language teaching, think about who is visible in society, who is seen and perceived by people in accordance with their self-identifications, who is viewed as inferior, and in this manner, invisible, not seen as an individual, but as a type, one of those people. We have seen the consequence of this practice of rendering our fellow human beings as being invisible, with the ongoing legacy of oppression, violence, and imprisonment of people who have no visibility, in the sense that their faces are the face of the enemy when constructed at the convenient time to do so. And with the refugees fleeing from the war in Ukraine into Poland and other countries and being welcomed there, which of course is praiseworthy, Were refugees from Sudan, Iraq, and Afghanistan also warmly welcomed in European countries? No? Gee, I wonder why. To what extent, though, however, have we as individuals rendered ourselves invisible at times, whether it's our gendered, sexual, racialized, or class identities and backgrounds? In his book, Big Little Man in Search of My Asian Self, Alex Tazan writes that, quote, whether we acknowledge it or not, we are each a plethora of identities, end of quote. But which identities do we select to perform with certain people? Which ones are ascribed to us by other people? And which ones are accepted by whom and in which contexts? The research on language learning and teaching has started to evolve beyond the traditional narrow focus in second language acquisition research and critically addressing not only the language use in discourses emerging in the classroom and beyond, but also, as Flores and Rosa propose, shifting, quote, from focusing SLA research on the language practices of the racialized speaking subject toward the uptake of the white listening subject, end of quote. The need to focus on the white listening subject is crucial because, as Zeus Leonardo argued, quote, despite the fact that racial domination precedes us, whites daily recreated on both the individual and institutional level, end of quote. And when we speak of white domination, quote by Leonardo, it is not solely the domain of white supremacist groups. It is rather the domain of average tolerant people, of lovers of diversity, and believers in justice, and thus, in general, whites recreate their own racial supremacy despite good intentions, end of quote. One example of this is the historically white universities in the US, otherwise known as white institutionalized spaces, where there is a process of learning that, quote, whiteness is right, by Wendy Moore, in which, quote, a normalized ideology and socialization process that white is ideal permeates every nook and cranny of the United States, end of quote, by Chow, Lee, and Ho. One example of this white is ideal is my own lived experiences that Kathy Park Hong, in her book, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, captured brilliantly, quote, I've been raised and educated to please white people, and this desire to please has become ingrained into my consciousness. Even to declare that I'm writing for myself would still mean I'm writing to a part of me that wants to please white people, end of quote. Over 20 states in my country have either banned the teaching of critical race theory or submitted legislation to do so. In a supposedly free country, why is the teaching of actual US history that is frequently omitted in many curriculum textbooks so threatening to some people? Perhaps one obvious example was when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, there were no history lessons taught on the indigenous peoples of this land. The only representations I saw of Native Americans were in Hollywood films and television shows portraying them as primitive savages who needed to be civilized when they were not being genocidally murdered by the white saviors played by actors such as John Wayne and Clint Eastwood in bearing the white man's burden. However, when I was 12 years old, my late mother bought me a Christmas present, a book entitled Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown. And reading this book literally changed my world because it had not only made me fall in love with reading the histories that were never taught to me in school, but also importantly, it fostered my lifelong critical engagement with the ideologically driven and selected historical representations and discourses of nation, who belongs to a country, society, and the others in mass and social media. An example of this discourse that is being used, that teaching children about the history of race violence will be traumatizing for the students and making them feel uncomfortable. There's a social meme showing the photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, the first Black students to attend classes at the all-white Little Rock Central High School in the southern state of Arkansas, being harassed on her way to on her first day of school. She spent only 1 year there, and in the years since, she has struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder and has attempted suicide twice. And the caption reads, quote, so the folks who tried to prevent a Black girl from going to school in 1957 are opposed to the grandchildren learning about how they tried to prevent a Black girl from going to school in 1957. Another meme shows Ruby Bridges, who was the first child to desegregate the all-white elementary school in New Orleans in 1960 and had to be escorted by U.S. Marshals just to attend her classes with the caption, quote, "If this child was strong enough to survive it, your child is strong enough to learn about it." End of quote. But as always, there is hope and promise for a better world, because in another meme, it shows a young child holding the book called The 1619 Project, Born on the Water, about the enslavement and Black resistance in the United States. And it says, quote, I asked my 9-year-old how she felt reading this book as a white person. She said, I think the only white people that feel bad or mad or uncomfortable reading about the stuff that white people did in history are the people who want to do it again, end of quote. And with the recent banning of Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, Mouse, A Survivor's Tale, in Tennessee classrooms, and the numerous book burnings that have been taking place in my country, William Faulkner's line from his novel Requiem for a Nun, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," is as pertinent as ever. And speaking of teaching Mouse, in my article, Critical Literacies and Graphic Novels for English Language Learners, Teaching Mouse, which relates my collaborating with a public school teacher developing lesson plans in their teaching of Mouse to secondary school English language learners, many of whom were immigrants from Central America. Almost all of these students did not have any books in their homes other than the required school textbooks because their parents could not afford them. These students did not know much, if at all, about World War II, and none had ever heard about the Holocaust. But after being introduced to this graphic novel in the class, they became passionate about learning history because many aspects of Spiegelman's story related to their own lived experiences in being discriminated against and othered. One example of this is the detailed presentation in Mouse showing how the Nazis first dehumanized the Jewish people through language and thus demonstrated to the teacher's students of how people can use the violence of language to create a materialized reality of violence, as we've seen here in my country throughout its history and many others, of course, and especially since 2016. As Toni Morrison observed, quote, "Oppressive language does more than represent violence, it is violence." Teaching our students not just vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar, but also how language works in everyday life can help develop their critical language awareness, which is crucial in working for a more democratic society. So let me first share my lived experience, having been born in the United States, in which I've lived most of my life. I identify as a proud native New Yorker, raised in what was then a predominantly white working class neighborhood in the borough of Queens, New York City. My neighbors included garment salespeople and Holocaust survivors, including the mother of my best friend at the time and my next door neighbor, who I first learned about the Holocaust because once when I was at his apartment with my mother, I asked him, "Why do you have numbers on your arm?" And he told me why, and it was literally a life-changing moment for me as a 5-year-old. I went to public school 152, and because this was the era of busing, the New York State's attempt to integrate public schools, since many neighborhoods in New York were and still are mainly segregated along racial and class lines, my classmates were from many racial and ethnic backgrounds. I don't remember ever hearing one racist word on the school's playground or in the hallways. But when I was 8 years old, my family moved to a small suburban town on Long Island, about 72 kilometers from New York City. This was in the late 1960s, but the town seemed to be decades behind the city. My family was the first Asian Americans in the town, which was 99% white. Unlike my Queens neighborhood, my new classmates on the first day of my new school immediately perceived me as the other. During lunch recess that day, I received a welcome reception from about a dozen boys on the playground. They approached me and formed a circle and started singing in unison, "Chinese, Japanese, slanty eyes, dirty knees, go back to China or Japan, you chink." I was actually shocked, much more than scared, because it was the first time I'd ever heard the word chink. In the ensuing years, I've heard it numerous times along with people yelling at me, "Go back to China, you Chinaman." Although I never heard any teacher use a racist term addressing or referring to any classmate of mine, when I was in 6th grade, my history teacher was giving a lecture and had cited an incorrect date for a historical event we were learning about. I raised my hand and politely said, I think it's actually year so-and-so. The teacher paused and then said, "Ah, yes, you're right. Foiled by super chink again." How many of you have experienced something like this from your teacher when you were in the classroom? The things seemed to have changed a bit when I entered my adolescent years in the 1970s when I was in high school. My teachers would often socially position me in their classroom as a good and obedient student, this despite my often typical teenage rebel stance. When I would challenge a teacher on a school topic or make a joke to elicit laughs from my classmates, the teacher would reply, "Your sister was much better behaved than you." Yet I never heard this said to any of my classmates who had older siblings having had the same teacher. This in part contributed to my becoming a teenage rebel. I'd often show off in front of my friends, all white then, to reject the model minority position of having to be the good and submissive Asian. Once, when I was driving late at night in my father's car with several friends, and to show how cool I was, I purposely drove the opposite way on a one-way street while exceeding the speed limit. Seemingly out of nowhere, a motorcycle cop appeared behind my car and I pulled over. Instead of remaining seated in the driver's seat, I jumped out of the car and I asked the cop, "What's the matter, officer?" He replied, "Did you see the one-way sign?" Of course I lied. "Oh, I'm so sorry, officer, I didn't notice." He let me off with a warning and rode away. Looking back, I attribute this to my being a model minority who needed a nudge to get back to being a good boy. Had I been black, I most likely would have been shot dead, especially since I'd gotten out of the car to face him directly. Throughout my life in the US, I've been seen as the honorary white, at times being the model minority, but also in other contexts as the forever foreigner. Because of being the forever foreigner, as Phuc Tran, in his recent book, Saigon, a misfit's memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in, wrote, I try to erase my otherness, my Asianness, with an assimilation, an Americanization that was as relentless as it was thorough. You know one way to show that you fit in? By not fitting in. It's a weird counterintuitive trick. How do you do that in the social milieu of high school? You pick a subculture, exaggerate some part of yourself, draw attention to it, and then all the other things will fade into the background. If you're a Vietnamese kid in a small Pennsylvania town and you're getting your ass kicked because you're Asian, what does this mean? You go punk rock, like you go full punk. Get the leather jacket. End of quote. When I read this book 2 years ago, I realized why I've been wearing a black leather jacket since my teenage years. It has been in this context of being born an American, but often not being recognized as such, solely based on my visage, that has made me feel like an internal outsider in my country. My maternal ancestors immigrated to the US over 100 years ago. My father and 8 of my uncles served in the US Army during World War II, and our families recently received the U.S. Congressional Gold Medals of Honor that were awarded to all the Americans of Chinese ancestry who were in the military during that war. But why have they never been seen as American as certain people? This feeling informed and shaped my interactions with my English language learners and international graduate students who have voiced their own sentiments of feeling culturally and socially estranged and dislocated. In the past 20 years or so, there have been various textbook representations of Asian immigrant success stories and perceived racial, cultural, and linguistic differences among students in the context of English language learning classrooms in the US and Canada. This trend has been part of the larger discourse and social circulation of why immigrants from some countries have made it in society, but not others. Although these discursive representations appear to be well-intentioned in their attempts to acknowledge superdiversity, Such discourses have warranted closer critical examinations of the ways in which they racialize, essentialize, and perpetuate these historical identities. From the mid-1960s until the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the various interactional engagements and contextual encounters taking place in local community businesses throughout the US, such as Asian American restaurants and laundries, as well as in the neighborhoods and schools, have helped to construct the indexical order discourse of Asian Americans as the model minority. This positioning of Asian Americans as a monolithic, homogeneous group conveniently ignores not only the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and historical diversities among and within communities identified as Asian American, but also their blatantly huge economic disparities and resulting poverty levels. One example of this was the 2018 film Crazy Rich Asians that reinforced the now common perception of the typical wealthy Asian family, which the Asian American woman marries into. But this discourse of the model minority also goes beyond this in its racializing strategy to anoint one group as the model over other minorities in the US, particularly the Black community. One of the first published uses of the term model minority was by the sociologist William Peterson in his 1966 article published in the New York Times Magazine, in which he praised the achievements of Japanese Americans for having strong family values and work ethics. And yet, starting in 1942, the entire Japanese American population, with the exception of those who were later allowed to enlist in the US Army to serve their country in the war against Nazi Germany, was incarcerated by President Roosevelt during World War II because of their ancestry and the fear that they would betray their country fighting Japan, although not one had ever been charged for committing treason. Then a mere 24 years later, their seemingly inherent traits of working hard and loving their family due to their culture, with the implication that other cultures lack these traits, made them the model minority instead of being the problem minority, as Peterson coined it during World War II. Was it just a sheer coincidence, this remarkable turnaround of Japanese Americans from being the potential enemy within to the model minority occurred during the 1960s civil rights movement fighting for the equal rights of Black Americans? So this myth of the model minority, quote, creates the illusion of a universal success that homogenizes variation among Asian communities and erodes the struggles rooted from the issues of health, immigration, poverty, language, and education faced by the very same on a daily basis, end of quote, by Miller, Nguyen, and Gosman. Another biographical example of an issue of how language and education are related to race, ethnicity, class, and identity is the following. After high school, I went to a small private liberal arts college in a small rural town in Pennsylvania, Franklin and Marshall. It was my first encounter with classmates who came from very affluent backgrounds. My first year cohort comprised of a third of the students who attended preparatory schools throughout their entire schooling and who had either lived abroad or at least traveled overseas. I remember meeting a classmate who told me he was from New York City, and I said, "Really? You don't sound like a New Yorker. Where in New York City do you live?" He said, "Park Avenue." So this was my first introduction to applied linguistics decades before I started studying and learning about it. I also met for the first time several people outside my extended family that might have looked similar to me in terms of socially constructed ethnic physiognomic categories in the eyes of some casual bystanders. Two fellow classmates who were from Hong Kong but had attended exclusive private schools in the States. During spring break vacations, they would fly off to Switzerland to ski while I would take the 5-hour train ride back home to New York. It was then I started to feel the disparities in social class and its attendant lived experiences in important ways, because although others might have viewed those two classmates as me as being of the same race or culture based on our superficially perceived physical similarities, I had nothing in common with them. in terms of their wealth, socioeconomic status, lived experiences, and accompanying outlook on their own prospects in life. But because I was viewed as being the model minority student, I was expected to excel. An incident during the first few months of my first year in college illustrates this. I met with a counselor to plan my course of study. I confided to the guidance counselor I was having troubles adjusting to college life, in part because I was living away from my family for the first time, and the college's remote location in that rural part of Pennsylvania. The counselor listened and nodded and then told me I should do my best to overcome these inconveniences and adjust better because, quote, you don't want to end up being a coolie someday, do you? End of quote. I was too shocked and dumbfounded to protest his racializing labeling, and so I mumbled an acknowledgement and quickly got up and left his office, never to return. And in fact, I was placed on academic probation after my first semester because I had failed my calculus class and received a D in my chemistry class, even though I had taken classes in both subjects in high school. And this illustrates the assumptions that just because one might do well in high school does not guarantee one's success in university because of several factors, including social class, in that neither of my parents went to college, so they could not offer me advice and guidance on how to succeed academically. Nelson Flores, in his article, A Tale of Two Visions, Hegemonic Whiteness and Bilingual Education, cites the work of Thomas Paul Bonfiglio, in which he, quote, describes the development of standardized American English as a racial-linguistic project that sought to discursively produce the American bourgeoisie in opposition to the racialized other, end of quote. What became standard American English was rooted in the Midwestern speech patterns because of the racist and xenophobic movements during the early 20th century that viewed New York and other large cities on the East Coast as being infiltrated by immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Thus, quote, one way that the whiteness of individuals and communities was then determined was through their ability to linguistically discipline themselves by engaging in these idealized language practices, which in turn justified their access to or exclusion from the material benefits of hegemonic whiteness, end of quote. Some of these communities were accepted into hegemonic whiteness, quote, while other communities were racialized in ways that excluded them from ever attaining this ideal, end of quote. One example of this is throughout my life, I've heard this many a time. You speak English really well. As Kubota, Carella, Lim, and Sa wrote in their recent article, Your English is So Good, in linguistic experiences of racialized students and instructors of a Canadian university, quote, racial linguistic ideology resonates with reverse linguistic stereotyping in which the visual image of a speaker's race triggers listeners' positive or negative perceptions of the speaker's linguistic competence. But this is not only with people outside of academia, because once when I was attending an academic conference a few years back, I introduced myself to a well-known scholar in applied linguistics. They looked at my attendee badge and noted that I was affiliated at the time with the City University of Hong Kong. They then asked me, oh, so where did you go to school in Hong Kong? I replied very politely, no, I'm on the faculty in the English department at City University of Hong Kong. They answered, yes, I see that, but where did you go to school there? I restrained myself from literally shaking my head and said, yeah, I'm from New York, have a good day, and immediately walked away. What I wanted to tell the person was, you call yourself an applied linguistic and you can't tell that I'm from New York? As Frank Wu wrote in his book, Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, quote, assimilation and multiculturalism have both their leftist and rightist variations. Together, they place Asian Americans in a no-win bind between being all American and being gooks, being ordered one day along the lines, you should just be an American, and being pitied another day with, it's too bad you lost your culture, end of quote. This quote applies, of course, to all the other people, including students whose family members, ancestors came from around the world. And again, this is not new because all of us have originally come from around the world, yes? And if one wonders why I keep talking about race, well, as Ralph Ellison put it in his novel Invisible Man, I'm riding the race I'm forced to ride. So it's important to address these issues with our students in terms of how this plays out again in their own experiences, and how they might share this with in the classrooms, in that what would be some of these possible teaching approaches to help render the invisible visible. And one approach would be what I just basically presented today in autoethnography, the account of one's lived experiences, grounded in the context and interactions with people. And a student's autoethnography can be written, spoken with not only words, but of course with images. And in sharing their personal histories with fellow classmates and their teachers, these oral and written presentations can then relate to the larger histories often not told and ignored, as I mentioned previously. And the aim of this, of course, is not just to facilitate their English language learning or any language learning in a variety of registers, academic and non-academic, but to also foster in building and supporting and connecting with other communities outside their own. And this is going to be crucial if we're ever going to live in a more humane, just, and peaceful society shorn of ignorance, rape, hate, and violence. And I think this is important, where the idea around the discourse, again, where, as you well know, many a political leader has presented the discourse of a nostalgic longing for a fictionalized past in which a specified and named people are accorded the singularized and sole identity of the nation. This discourse of a, quote, doleful nostalgia for unrealizable paradise lost that is perhaps no less debilitating or distorting than ideology itself, end of quote by Gardner, has an extremely effective and affective appeal to those who lament their relative loss of economic status and attribute this to the other. This discourse has two aims, the first of which is the construction of a quote, conservative utopia, which is characterized by an ideological appeal to an idealized and mythologized past which delegitimates any challenge to the reigning social order, end of quote, by Gardner. And this in effect dismisses or the cries among those who are suffering from job losses and declining living standards. The framing of us and you in presenting a selected unity of a certain demographic along racialized and classed ones aids in shifting the focus away from the hegemonic political and social order of the elites to an ideologically invented adversary, the them. This co-construction of the them is the second function that acts in dialogical tandem with the chosen us, who are accorded the singular, nationalistic, racialized, and linguistic identity. In the case of the US society, being white English-speaking Americans. Indeed, the role of politically motivated and produced emotions of particular people, quote, provide a script, certainly. You become the you if you accept the invitation to align yourself with the nation and against those others who threaten to take the nation away, end of quote, by Ahmed. And this has had, as we know, historical consequences, including not only the violence enacted toward particular immigrant communities and individuals, but has also served to sustain the reigning power elites' divide and rule strategy for generations. As the late Mike Davis argued, quote, "It is important to challenge the communist assertion that immigration per se, hordes of peasants, created an unmeltable and cultural backward heterogeneity that vitiated class unity," end of quote. It was never the immigrants who that undermined attempts at working class unity, inasmuch as, quote, "their conscious decision to forge larger ethnic solidarities as the basis for communal organization in America was often a defensive reaction to exclusion and victimization in the new country." And this has led to the working class in the US continuing to find its social identity in the fragmentary ethnic and racial communities, end of quote. And this resulting in this, as the result of this, us and you and them discourse. And of course, this long-running playbook of divide and rule of the working class has not been limited to only the United States. So in conclusion, I would say that a better world is possible only when we all work together in unity and solidarity against the powers that be and the system in place that benefits the 1% in ruling over us, and it's dividing us, we, the 99%. And instead of looking for someone else to save us from the system every 4 years or so in elections, as the late Chinese American activist Grace Lee Boggs have often said, quote, "We are the leaders we are looking for," end of quote. Thank you.
Dr. Chun, thank you so very much. As expected, this is a very touching theme, and I think not only in America, but also all around the world, and Brazil is not exception, although we've been hearing about that we don't have race problems, that we don't see people, colors and races and etc. We do know that this is not true. So I couldn't help but applauding you when you mention about the, if people who has been racist and who has done wrong, let's say this, couldn't help to be accountable for what they've done, or I mean their ancestors. If people who have suffered that could survive, they can surely. And I think this is very important that they know what not only they did, but they have been doing every single day with non-white people everywhere. So I think it's very important for us to keep this in mind. And anyway, I'm sorry for this, but I would like to open for questions and answers. And I would like to ask people to come up here, share their names, with institution they're from. If they don't feel comfortable speaking English, they can ask in Portuguese, but please come here and let's talk a little bit about this. You just, okay. So you have to go there and
Thanks. Okay. Hello, everyone. Is it too loud? Okay. Hello, Dr. Chun. This is Liberato Santos from Instituto Federal de Goiás. We are at I work at the city where the event is taking place, actually. So during this, first of all, thank you for this great talk. During this seminar, there were incredible presentations from people who have been discussing. Thank you. From people who have been discussing ways to promote critical thinking that leads to agency, both student-learner agency and teacher-educator agency in our field. So, in your experience, working at a campus, at your university, what are, in your view, some ways in which critical thinking that leads to agency has happened in practical ways to help unseen student populations to become seen? Whoever these members of different populations are from your own campus. So what are the examples of practices, maybe your own practices of your colleagues, that lead to this, the promotion of critical thinking that leads to agency and to visibility? Thank you.
Right, no, thank you for that question. That's a great, that's very important. So I'll relate an anecdote. This was a few years back. In one of my graduate classes, the students who were getting their masters, and most of them were in-service teachers, public school teachers in the greater Boston area. And in one of the courses I taught to them, which is the Language, Culture, and Identity course, I introduced to them a broad range of theories connected with applied linguistics, and I was specifically mentioning the works of people like Stuart Hall in terms of the theories, but also, of course, the social linguistic practices that have been detailed. And one of my students, after completing the course, wrote me a very nice letter and said that he was in his classroom, and there were a number of his students who self-identify as African American, and they were speaking the, I'm using in scare quotes, the non-standardized white, English, and they had been castigated, not surprisingly, they had been castigated by their other teachers of speak properly. And while they were speaking, he just joined their conversation and just said, and basically, affirmed their identity and their language use. And they were just so happy that a teacher was actually saying, oh, yeah, it's, feel free to speak, and that's your language, and and so they felt that there was an actual space in this public school classroom, where they could use their language and not being criticized and disciplined for it. And so I thanked him for that, because it was like, okay, this is actually, where, again, from the theory to the actual practice. I mean, and I quote to my students the quote by the Black Panther activist Fred Hampton, when he said, the theory is cool, but without practice, it ain't shit. So I think this is something that all of us as educators, where we're working with our fellow teachers and students to implement these theories into the actual classroom practices, just on that one example.
Thank you, Professor. Anyone else want to make any comment, a question? No? Well, so I'm gonna ask a question. This association started with a group of English teachers who went to the States. We were in a program specifically for teacher training, let's call so. And I was having, it was in Woodbridge, Virginia. And I was with my co-worker, not actually co-worker, but he was my colleague. He was an English teacher at the Federal Institute in São Paulo, and we were speaking English. And then a white guy came to us and he might have a good intention. So he said that I could speak plain English. And why your people, you are a foreigner, and you could, he asked this kind of question. You are a foreigner and you can speak plain English. Why your people can do it? It sounds so much better. And I was thinking who my people were. And then he never said, but I have some suspicion who were. And he was complaining, actually, why black people had to speak that way if his way was much better. And if a foreigner can learn that, why couldn't they? So I had this linguicism, which, of course, I think that his intention was good, but anyway, it was terribly racist. And why they should speak, why his way would be better or plainer than the other way. And then I realized, my God, why do I speak this English? Because I was never exposed I started learning English when I was 8. And there were recordings, we were using audiolingual. It was the 80s and 90s. And we did have 2 black characters because they would repeat the same characters the whole course. And I could never hear a black person speaking English. So all that models, they were given by white people. So of course, I would speak English closer to a white American than a black American. So this made me reflect that we only have those pictures representing black people, but I still have the tapes because I worked at the same language center, and I could never realize there were no one but white people, usually from, I don't know, Chicago and those regions in the States, right? Certain regions. I could never hear a Texan, for example, or could realize there was a person from Texas who was speaking English. So this is something that made me reflect a lot.
Thank you for that. Yes. Yeah, it's unfortunately, yes, that is quite typical of, right, and I think part of that, at least in the US, as you probably know, applied linguistics is never taught in high school. It's almost never even taught in like undergraduate studies in many universities. So people, they grow up, of course, and they just perpetuate and reinforce this, linguicism. And I think this is a part of a larger project, of course, in which we, really need to advocate in terms of having this done in high school curriculum, and we're just introducing this idea around, language is not what you think it is.
Thank you. Any other comment? No? Okay, so Dr. Chun, I would like to thank you immensely for being here with us and for taking part. This is the second time you were part of ABRALITEC, a live series. So I want to thank you once again for being with us. And hopefully on our next editions, you could come in person to Brazil. It will be a great pleasure to hear you and to talk to you personally.
Yes, thank you very much again for inviting me. I appreciate it. Yes, and this was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, people, food for thought, at least for me. I hope you have enjoyed as much as I did. I will switch to Portuguese, I'm sorry. Então, foi um prazer imenso, assim. Era uma fala que eu estava com bastante expectativa, pena que ele decidiu não usar o vídeo, a apresentação que ele tinha traz cenas bem fortes, talvez não, né, não sei se foi por isso ou se teve problema técnico, mas enfim, mas acho que vale bastante a pena. Ele tem se dedicado muito a questões políticas partidárias, a questão do capitalismo. É uma leitura assim bastante interessante, né, e sempre fazendo relação com a linguística aplicada. E ele entra agora, está fazendo uma autoetnografia, alguma coisa nesse sentido, que tem ganhado fôlego também nas pesquisas. Então, acho que é interessante a gente ficar atentos, né, e atentas. Pessoal, acho que nós vamos, então, né, estamos quase encerrando. Vamos para a parte dos sorteios. E aí, lembrando que nós vamos... né, todo esse material está disponível no site da UFG, então vai ficar disponível também na parte da ABRALITEC. E agora eu gostaria, vamos, né, como eu disse... ok. Aí ele só vai trocar o link.